evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Mahoning Drive-In Theater, the largest single-screen drive-in in the United States. We're certainly glad you could be with us this evening, and don't forget the concession stand is open with all kinds of great things to eat and drink.
Welcome back to another episode of Mahoning Drive-In Radio. Mark here, General Manager, General Mangler at the Mahoning Drive-In Theater in Lehighton, Pennsylvania, and I am here with a very special guest. Now, we have shown many Cannon films over the years here and there. Now, we've never done a dedicated Cannon weekend yet, but I know we will one day because people keep asking. And they were the movies of our youth for so many of us of a certain age. They were constantly on the video store racks, constantly on cable, and constantly in the theaters. And we have with us today Austin Trunick, the author of two books about Cannon films, entitled The Cannon Film Guide Volume 1, 1980 to 1984, and the new Cannon Film Guide Volume 2, 1985, 1987. And he is here today to talk to us about Tobe Hooper's Life Force. Life Force is going to be screening Life Force as opposed to Life Horse. That's a different movie. It's a different film company. We're not talking about that today. Life Force will be screening as part of Exhumed Films Zombiefest on Friday, May 27th at the Mahoning Drive-In Theater. It's going to be sandwiched. It's going to be cozy in a little sandwich between Chud and People Who Own the Dark. So Austin, welcome. And how did you come to want to write a book about Cannon films, let alone two books?
Well, you've really touched on it. I grew up in the 80s in the video store era. And during that time, Cannon was hard to miss, especially I grew up in Eastern Ohio, so really not near any convenient movie theaters. So my relationship, my education in movies was through going to the video store on Friday night and renting things. And yes, in the late 80s in that time, you couldn't spin around in a circle without knocking 4 or 5 Cannon movies off a shelf, no matter what section you were in.
MGM silver. Yes.
Beautiful, beautiful artwork. And yeah, they were great at marketing too. They knew how to make a cover look enticing, especially when they were in those giant boxes of beautiful painted exploitation art. But yeah, I ended up, after years and years of freelancing, writing about films for various outlets, I wanted to work on something that could be my own sort of just project, a book project. And I really thought back to where it all began. And the movies, watching Charles Bronson, Chuck Norris movies, ninja movies with my dad and with my friends as a youth is where I fell in love with movies. And Cannon is a company that, as you start to peel back the layers of these films, look under the covers and see what's going on, usually the stories behind them are as crazy as what you see on screen. So I just got very interested in trying to find out everything I could about all these different movies. Originally, I wanted to write one book about my 50 favorite Cannon films, and obviously that grew into something much bigger as I had to hear one story and I'd talk to somebody and they'd tell me to talk to somebody else, and you'd hear just more wild things as you go. But yeah, it basically snowballed into this project, which has been these 3 books covering really all the Golden Globes productions that were released by Cannon in the 80s and then heading into the early 90s.
And Cannon as an entity folded approximately when?
1995 was when the last video releases stopped trickling out. 94 was their last theatrical release. But even by that point, they were just sort of pushing all the product that they had sitting on shelves into theaters to try to make up money that that they owed people.
It's such, and I know a little bit here and there about Cannon from watching, 1 or 2 documentaries that have come out and stories from various people who worked on them. But wild and woolly is kind of the pair of words that come to mind when I think about them in terms of the content of the films and all of the behind the scenes. I mean, we were talking a little bit before we started recording about something we won't get into today, but it was the habit of Cannon on occasion to maybe announce a film that hadn't really been solidified as going to happen yet, but they would throw these trade ads, these splashy trade ads out there saying, this is the great thing we have coming. Somebody else would go, well, was it Cannon who had announced the Spider-Man film?
Yes. Actually, for the first part of its production history at Cannon was going to be directed by Tobe Hooper, the director we're talking about today. But yeah, they had announced for a while it was going to be an Albert Pune movie. For a while it was going to be a Joe Zito movie. Really, almost everyone who was at Cannon in the late 80s it seems like every director was attached to this Spider-Man film that never happened for at least a little while.
I've often thought about that film and thought about with the level that Canon was working at the time, what would a Canon Spider-Man film have looked like? And I feel like it would have been much closer to the 70s TV show at best than it would have the film that we got from Sam Raimi many years later. So Tobe Hooper came to Canon. How did Tobe Hooper come to Canon Films?
Well, he came to Canon right after Poltergeist. Poltergeist had been a big success critically and commercially, and Canon approached him with a 3-picture deal. And initially those 3 pictures were going to be LifeForce, which was, I'll get into in a little bit, was a project that Canon, that Golden Globus specifically, had brought with them to Canon. Actually predates their time at Canon, something they'd been wanting to make for years in advertising. The second one is Invaders from Mars, which was something that Tobe had pitched to them, a movie that he loved and wanted to remake, something from his childhood, one of his favorite movies. And the third one would have been Spider-Man. Part of the deal was, as well, is that he would produce. He wasn't going to direct at that time, but he was going to produce a sequel to Texas Chainsaw Massacre for the company. But that's a movie he ended up having to direct himself when they couldn't find a director later on. But yeah, so LifeForce was something that they had offered him. With the first time, Menachem Golan, who was really one of the two Israeli cousins that were the head of Canon at the time, he met with Tobe Hooper and he handed him a copy of Colin Wilson's book, the novel Space Vampires. And Tobe took it home, directed it, read it, and decided he wanted to direct it. And yeah, Canon's relationship with Tobe Hooper was happened very fast. He made these 3 movies over the course of really 2 years, and it was really one after another. LifeForce was a 6-month shoot, and for Canon, it was at the time the most expensive movie they had ever made. They were known for making these $5 million or less exploitation films, ninja films, action films, a lot of Chuck Norris movies, a lot of Bronson movies. But LifeForce was going to be their $24 million sci-fi epic. It was going to be the sci-fi event of the 1980s as they kept advertising it. And they needed a director who they felt was on that level, and Tobe Hooper, coming off the success of Poltergeist, seemed like a slam dunk to them.
And I do remember from watching LifeForce, back then, and a couple times every so many years, I'll watch LifeForce again. It does have a big feel to it, especially for Canon, but it does. My memory of it, at least, is that it feels like it could have been a major studio release, as opposed to Canon, which was, what would you call Canon? A mini major, an independent juggernaut, something like that. The mini major is a very good way to describe them. In a lot of their print advertising, they would always describe themselves as the next major studio. So that was something they were really striving towards. And LifeForce was a movie that they hoped would get them to that next level where they were competing with the Fox, the Columbia, the big studios, but rather than the independents. Were they distributed? Did they distribute their own films in the 80s, or were they? I know their home video was mostly MGM UA home video when they were released originally. Did somebody else distribute their films, or were they getting them in theaters and booking them themselves?
It's a mix. There's a lot of they bounced around a lot. They had a partnership with MGM for a lot of these early years. LifeForce ended up being a Trimark release in the US. But by the mid-'80s, they had a deal worked out with Warner Brothers. So Warner Brothers got some of their films, obviously like Superman 4 and Over the Top. They're big ones during that time. They did distribute some of their own, some of the smaller ones. If they couldn't find a partner, they had to put them in the theaters themselves. But Canon was a company that I don't think they were as interested in the actual distribution and marketing once the movies were out, trying to promote the theatrical release, because they made their money pre-selling the films, selling them to cable, to video, and to every territory around the world. That was their model, which, I mean, that's the Corman model. And Menachem Golan was a student of Roger Corman.
And that's where a lot of those splashy trade ads would come in that people now look at and have fun with, where these films were announced that never got made. But a lot of it was, correct me if I'm wrong, them trying to put together a great film, pre-sell it, and then start the process of actually figuring out how to make it.
Right. They would take out these, and you look at just 1980 alone, they have 4 different sets of gigantic ads that would run in the trades, 15 to 25 pages. And this, when the company's just starting out, And these would be wacky ideas. And whatever would stick, they would take them to Cannes, they would take them to the American film market and MIFA. And whatever ideas stuck, enough people were interested in, say they generated $5 million worth of sales for a ninja film. They would send it in production with a budget of $1.5 million. So they had already made their money, and they were already using that to produce, just spreading it all around to produce other movies. Cannon, a lot of people like to look at the box office numbers to judge how successful a film was. And when it comes to Cannon, that doesn't really work well because they had made their money already before they had made a lot of these films, which is why they were able to make so many. If it came out in the box office and opened at the bottom, number 11 for the week, and fell out of theaters, that didn't hurt them that much because, again, they made their profit before the film even went into production.
So with Life Force, you mentioned it was based on a book called Space Vampires. I remember watching, it may have been a rerun, but I remember watching Late Night with David Letterman back in the 80s, and Billy Idol was the guest. And at one point, Letterman asked him what he had coming up, and he said he was going to do a film with Tobe Hooper called Space Vampires. Do you know anything about the potential of Billy Idol having been in Life Force?
Well, Tobe Hooper had directed a Billy Idol video, and a part.
It was Dancing with Myself, right?
Yes, Dancing with Myself. I was trying to remember which one it was. And during that time, Tobe had reached out to Billy afterwards, asking him if he wanted to get involved. And the part, from what I understand, is that he offered was in the film one of the male vampires. There's really three main vampires in it, Matilda May, and then two men. And the one is played by Mick Jagger's brother in the film. But that would have been the one that Billy Idol would have played. But from what I've figured out is that Billy couldn't make it work because of the scheduling, just the issues of this was a movie that was a 6-month shoot, and you kind of had to be there the whole time, and it's hard to nail down a pop star for that long too.
He was still in his prime at that point, shall we say?
Mm-hmm.
And this was shot in England?
Yes, yeah. The big parts were actually the big set pieces, especially all the stuff with the spaceship that you see at the beginning of the film. Most of this was shot at Elstree Studios, which is the very famous studios in London where a lot of the Star Wars films were shot. Raiders of the Lost Ark, Stanley Kubrick shot some things there. It was a studio and a sound stages that actually Cannon would buy later in 1986 and would kind of contribute in a big way to their demise. Just when you're a company that your bread and butter is making $3 to $5 million Chuck Norris and Charles Bronson movies, you don't need one of the biggest, most expensive sound stages in the world. And you don't really have the use for it. But yeah, this was shot at Elstree Studios. A lot of the stuff you see at the end with kind of the zombie invasion with John Dykstra's special effects and zombies running around in the film at the end, that was shot on the back lot there. And there's actually, you see a lot of London destroyed. There was a nearby amusement park just outside of London, which had a giant model, basically one of these models you could walk on of London that they actually borrowed and set up the explosives and built little buildings that they could burn down on it.
They gave it back. Here's your husk of a model.
Yep. Hopefully we didn't trash it too bad.
I once met Steve Railsback at a convention.
Oh, nice.
And my friends and I had just gotten into watching Life Force, so we had just watched it recently. And as viewers may or may not know, and I'm just speaking as a red-blooded hetero male, Matilda May is in the film, and she's naked the whole time. And we had said to Steve Railsback, we were like, "So, how was it making Life Force with Matilda May?" And he just smiled, and he said she was 19 and naked all the time. So, and then he just smiled to us, and we had him sign a photo to a friend of ours, signing it Steve Railsback, the luckiest man in the world, or something like that. It was just one of those things where Life Force is a film that just keeps on giving when you're a male teenager or watching it, or at least it was for us. And so she was like fully, and I'm not trying to be lascivious or crude. We're analyzing an aspect of this film. She was like naked on set for pretty much all of her scenes, I would imagine. Or I guess if it was a close-up, she would have been partially covered. But do you know if they like closed the set to any degree when she did that, or was it just the full crew and her walking around in the all together?
She was just nude.
Wow.
There was no closed sets or anything because Tobe Hooper would refer to her nudity as Matilda's costume because it was such a, like you said, her character was always naked. She would have to walk around naked. There's actually a scene that when I see it in the film, I feel really bad because you see her, she kind of blows out the windows of the facility that she's being kept in, and she wanders off into the darkness when she escapes from this laboratory where they're studying her after she causes all this havoc. And you see her walk into the night, and you can sort of see like the breath as she's walking out.
Ooh.
It was below freezing in London there, and they still shot the scene with her nude. There's a tree you see her walk towards, and there is a PA or someone standing behind the tree with a blanket just to really like wrap her up because they made this poor girl had to keep walking, just wandering off outdoors, fully nude.
That's dedication.
Yeah, so actually they beyond her nudity, she had to spend a lot of time in makeup chairs. I spoke to Nick Maley for the book, who handled the prosthetics and the makeup for the film. He oversaw all those departments. He was very busy on Life Force, but they had to make her look almost alien. She's a beautiful woman, and obviously she's wearing no clothes, but they had to put makeup on her skin and sort of give her that alien glow. And her performance, I mean, you remember the nudity, but she was also a ballerina before she got into film. And the way she walks and handles herself is very dancer-like.
Oh yeah, there is an otherworldly quality about her presence in the film. Mm-hmm. I mean, the nudity is just one of these things where it catches your eye, and it's just like, wow, that person's never putting clothes on in this film. But aside from that, she is good in it. You know, you could have had just anybody walking around naked, and it wouldn't have been the same effect.
Again, that's something that really helped Cannon recoup a lot of the money when the movie was going out. It found a larger audience on cable, but especially on video. And I think a lot of that probably is the young men who are finding the movie and having a format where you can rewind it and fast forward it and pause things. I think that
the tape I rented gets fuzzy at certain times all the time.
Yes, the picture, you check your tracking right here.
But that was such a part of 70s, especially 80s movies, was like profanity, nudity, and gunplay. It was like it was sort of like the formula for making money in that era. And I'm sure Cannon, I know with Corman at New World, that was always something too. It's like, we need X number of scenes of nudity. We need this, we need that. And it was just, I mean, it's seen as exploitive or derogatory or misogynistic now, but at the time it was part of the commercial formula.
There's a quote from A Knock and Go On where they ask him, what do you say to people who say you only make schlock? And he says, well, schlock is a movie that people find entertaining. That's what I make. And it's true. That stuff, the exploitation market, especially in the video era, that was a place to make money. And these movies, exploitation movies, did well on video. That was really where a lot of them came.
That's their ultimate resting place, really.
Yes.
Theatrical.
Exactly.
I love going to the movies. To me, the movie theater experience is a very important thing. But ultimately, you're going to see things after the 6 months when they come out. You're ultimately going to see them on video. Video is where they live. Mm-hmm. Theatrical is the journey to get where they live. And, say what you will about schlock. We're talking about this movie right now. There's a lot of other movies that were much more high-minded. Interstellar was a great movie. I don't know that I would want to watch it more than once. Life Force, every few years I throw it in. Mm-hmm. Say what you will about my taste, I guess, but they're just entertaining. And they surprise you, which a lot of films don't do.
This is a movie that people seem to love or hate it, but you can see where, as it was leading into production and before it was coming out, where this had to have seemed like the easiest slam dunk for Canada, because they really assembled a dream team, I feel, of people to work on this film. I'm thinking of some of the names besides Tobe Hooper, who at that point was fresh off Poltergeist, a big name there. They had John Dykstra from Star Wars and Star Trek doing the effects. You had Nick Maley, who, another Star Wars alumni, who worked on, most famous for probably doing the Cantina band from Star Wars, but also working, one of the guys who designed Yoda, overseeing the practical effects in the film. It's written by Dan O'Bannon, who wrote Alien, and Don Jacoby, who collaborated with him and would go on and write other canon films. And the art direction is by Robert Cartwright and John Graysmark, who worked on 2001: A Space Odyssey. So if you're putting together a big science fiction film, that's a heck of a roster to be working on the stuff you see on screen, the effects and
yeah, it's got a great look, and the effects of I always think of them as the husks of people, of the depleted people whose life force has been depleted. Even as a kid, that was creepy. I mean, they're still effective. You can tell, they're puppets, but to me, over contemporary CGI, they feel like they're there, And the one thing that maybe on paper Life Force didn't have was like a really strong name cast. I mean, Railsback was certainly known. I don't know if I would say that he was a draw, but I feel like the effects in the trailer would be enough to get people in the door. Now, how did Life Force do theatrically in the US when it came out? Because I remember it coming out. I remember seeing, there used to be a show on Nickelodeon in the mid-ish 80s called Stand By Lights Camera Action that was hosted by Leonard Nimoy. And it was all like behind the scenes footage and behind the scenes reports on various movies. And I'm pretty sure that they did one on Life Force. So Life Force was actually advertised to Nickelodeon youth in 1985.
Wow. Life Force unfortunately it was not the sci-fi event of the 1980s that they had hoped it would be. It did just under 12 million in the US, which is high for a canon movie, but this was a $24 million movie. So it's disappointing. It opened behind Cocoon and The Goonies, I believe, on its opening weekend, but it also opened in a kind of a terrible summer to try to get your science fiction movie out there, because 85 would have been back to the juggernaut that was Back to the Future. It would have been competing against later on when it traveled around in prints. Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome, Day of the Dead,
Return of the Living Dead too.
Yes,
as well.
Dead, Explorers. I think they even did a re-release of E.T. that summer.
They did. I remember. So, and you're talking the majority of what you've just said, which were huge in the theater, taking up screens when in a time when there weren't as many multiplexes as there are now. Not everybody had a 16 or a 10 screener in their towns. At best, you had maybe 3 or 4. Those were all PG-13 movies for the most part, aside from the zombies. So I do wonder if its R rating might have hurt it a little bit too, because the family film was exploding that year.
And it was, I unfortunately, I feel like it was also really hurt by bad reviews. The critics kind of really tore it apart. And there's most famously, New York Times, Janet Maslin described the movie as his quote unquote hysterical vampire porn, which is not a pull quote,
which to me says, sign me up.
Yes. But it sounds fantastic. But also, we have to remember too, is the US, the rest of the world got a slightly longer version that makes a little more sense, gives you a little bit more plot, a little bit more background of the vampires than the US did.
I was going to ask about that because I know there are those two versions.
Yeah.
We're showing Life Force on 35 as we always do. It's where Exhumed Films is at our place. And I don't know which version we're getting, but I know there have been screenings in the US of the longer cut on film. And is there anything, it's more exposition, plot description? Like, I think I've seen both, but I really couldn't tell you the difference.
The most commonly available version is the 116-minute version, at least on home video now. And that's a lot of people refer it to as the director's cut or the international cut. That's the one that most of the world saw. And it was actually released as Space Vampires in most of the world. But you'd think that if anything was going to be cut, it was going to be the nudity or some of the blood that you get later on in the film. But no, it is exposition. Most of the stuff is just shortened quite a bit, mostly for pacing purposes. When they went to release in the US, Trimark had the US theatrical rights, and they actually asked Hooper to cut it down so that they could squeeze more screenings in per day. So 15 minutes were cut out, and yeah, it is mostly expositional. A lot of that is from the beginning. There's a lot more stuff that takes place on the Churchill at the beginning in the space shuttle, and you get more explanation in the labs. The scientists talk more about the nature of these creatures and where they might have come from. That's the bulk of what you lose. There's even even longer cut, which unfortunately I've never seen. I know it's out there somewhere, maybe in VHS tapes or people trading around, but it has the actual first 35 minutes of the movie take place on the shuttle at the beginning in space, which is just wild to think, because I'm kind of on the fence. I mean, some of that stuff between the two cuts, between the US cut and the international cut, they both have their perks. The international cut, the 116-minute cut, makes more sense plot-wise. You get a little bit more information about the vampires, but some of the scenes are too long. Like they probably, in a perfect world, could he would have made a cut somewhere in between the two of those. Just if somebody were to come up to me and tell me they prefer either version, I could I could understand the argument, and based on the day, my opinion will go either way.
Did Tobe Hooper ever express a preference? I mean, was the director's cut his true? Did he say the director's cut is this is what I want it to be, or was there later regret about any aspects of the film?
Well, the one aspect of the film, I don't think he really, probably wasn't a big deal to him from the impression that I get in the interviews you read with him, especially because he went from this straight into Invaders from Mars and Texas 2, and he talks a lot about it. And the only regret he expresses is the title change in the US. When they released it in the US, it was switched to LifeForce. LifeForce was the name, but in most of the world, they got it as Space Vampires. And Tobe very much preferred the Space Vampires title, because to him, he was kind of seeing this as his chance to make a 70mm style, like Hammer film, like a throwback to that. I know the Quatermass experiment was a big influence on him making this, but he also thought if it had been called Space Vampires, people would have gone into it, maybe not taken it as seriously as a lot of the critics
It is a
seem
much
to.
more like 50s throwback drive-in kind of title for it.
Exactly. Then that's what I think he really liked. He regretted a lot. He expressed a lot of regret that he had let them talk him into releasing it as LifeForce. But coming from Trimark and Canon, their thoughts were they didn't want people to look at this movie as Space Vampires from the same studio that brought you Hospital Massacre or New Year's Evil and all these other exploitation films.
It's harder to take it seriously. Not that it's a film to be taken deadly seriously, but it's harder to take it seriously with a title like that. Although I must say, if a double feature of Space Vampires and Invaders from Mars would look great on a drive-in theater market.
Yeah, for sure. So that was the one thing that he repeatedly went back to, is he thought, especially a lot of these interviews while he was making Invaders, he was making Invaders while LifeForce was in theaters and kind of belly flopping. So you could tell he was a little hurt by it doing poorly at the box office.
Now, what was the decision, if you know, to release LifeForce in 70mm? Because 70mm was very much a prestige format. I've heard about some other things later in the game. I think the latest thing I recall hearing about coming out in 70mm was like Terminator 2 or Far and Away or something like that. I mean, they did it into the 90s, but it tended to be reserved for films that studios were really trying to push as high class or event releases. Mm-hmm. And the idea that a Canon film would come out in 70 is just kind of amazing to me.
That's because that's what Canon thought they were getting when they were investing in LifeForce. They thought this was going to be one of these, especially critically acclaimed science fiction films. I think Canon kind of expected that they were getting a 2001 or something along those lines with this. And given the talent that they assembled for all of the visual effects and the money and time that went into it, this was a 6-month shoot for them. And this is a company that most of their movies shot in 8 or 9 weeks. And that was that decision. Some of the stuff it does benefit from having this large film format, I feel. You look at the stuff in the beginning where you have these astronauts entering this alien spaceship, and those are all backdrops that were those are matte paintings, which is just amazing to think because it looks incredible. You have people on cables, you have all of these practical effects assembled. This is one of these the last I feel one of the last great showcases for practical effects. Unfortunately, it's not in a movie that more people have a higher opinion of, but if you look at, there's a transformation scene where you have this withered monster that transforms the pathologist, but it sits up. It's this corpse that sits up on the table and eventually turns into Matilda May. There's the pathologist, and you see it a lot in the trailer. You see it a lot in the marketing materials. This animatronic, this puppet, basically, that Nick Maley and his team built was one of the most advanced animatronics that we've got to see on film. It had 20 puppeteers operating it, people under the table, people with strings, but also from 3 computers. They had whole computers built to move each finger and the servos in the face. And it's just an incredible piece of animatronics. And there weren't many films after that before everything went to computers, before you have Jurassic Park and Terminator 2 changing those things that really have that level of advanced work going into it. Something that's this is just an aside, but I think of this puppet that we see in the film, this animatronic, very advanced, something very canon. When LifeForce wrapped, Canon actually took that puppet and they were going to sell it so that another studio could redo it and use it for something else. And that was Canon's. We've got this awesome thing that we can recoup some of our money with. And the effects team actually had to swoop in and buy it, figure out a way to get that out of Canon's hands so that they didn't own it, so that it wouldn't go to their competitors, which is just
imagine it with a wig in some other movie or something like that.
Right. Well, we actually see it's one of the Mummy movies, The Scorpion King, but the movie for LifeForce, they had built made all these these withered husks, these basically dummies that they had thrown all over their set of London that they had built. And those just went into a warehouse and they got sold to some prop company, and they show up again in one of the Mummy movies.
Oh, wow.
They're years and years later, 15 years later, but it's just
from Canon to Universal with a budget exponentially higher than they were made for. Wow.
And I'm sure with Universal, it's just like, oh, we could spend money to build these. Oh, somebody already has a warehouse full of charred corpses that we can use.
That's a warehouse you don't want to step into accidentally with a flashlight.
No.
What's in here? Oh. So LifeForce, it lived its short life in theaters, and then it made its way onto VHS at the time.
Mm-hmm.
MGM UA home video. I still remember the box cover, and it's chugged along on home video. Like, I feel like it's gained appreciation, like a lot of these sort of things do, in its second life on video and cable.
Mm-hmm.
And it's gotten some, if I recall, it's gotten some rather deluxe Blu-ray releases, or at least one.
Yeah. It's actually getting a 4K release this summer from Scream Factory, which is, it's like, I believe probably the third film to get a full 4K scan, from the third Canon film to do that at this point. So I'll be eager to check that out to see how that looks in the HDR.
And as we know, the fourth film will be going bananas.
Oh, hopefully.
Because we need Dom DeLuise in 4K more than ever. So LifeForce is showing, as I mentioned at the top of the show, on Friday, May 27th on film. Come on out to Exhumed Films Zombiefest and see whether we get the theatrical US or international cut. I would really love to see that on the big screen with the word space vampires hitting the screen. I think that would just be phenomenal. We thank Austin Trunick for joining us. It was the first of what will be a series of these whenever we run a Canon film. We'll call it Canon Corner, I think. I dub the Canon Corner, and I would tap you in either shoulder with a sword if you were here. Go out and grab your copy of the Canon Film Guide, Volumes 1 and 2, covering cumulatively 1980 to 1987. I do not yet have a copy. I literally cannot wait to read this. Like, the more we've talked about this and the more I think about it, it's like, I saw so many Canon films. I rented so many Canon films in the old days, and they were their own thing. So thank you, Austin, for joining us. Is there anywhere online people can find you or your work?
Yeah, the best place is probably Twitter or Facebook. It's at Canon Film Guide, just all one word, on either site. But that's the place where I share a lot more of my findings beyond what's in the books. I refer to those as really the extra features for the book.
The world of Canon never stops expanding.
Oh, no, not at all. They keep digging and finding more and more.
Cool. I cannot wait to do this again. And I thank you once again. And for all of our listeners, thank you so much. Be sure to check us out on Facebook. And if you just go to mahoningdit.com, you can find us everything we do from there. Thank you very much. And we will see you at the drive-in.
Ladies and gentlemen, thanks again for coming out tonight to the Mahoning Drive-In Theater. We hope you'll come back and see us again real soon. The exit is on the right-hand side of the screen at the front of the field, and most importantly, have a very safe trip home. Good night and God bless you.